At exactly 2:47 p.m., the lawyer's words stopped Ngozi's heart. The will leaves everything to unmentioned heirs. She thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. Her husband had built an entire second life, and she had paid for it. The mahogany-paneled office of a prestigious Abuja law firm felt cold despite the afternoon sun streaming through large windows. Ngozi sat in a leather chair, still wearing her morning wrapper and head tie, the black fabric heavy on her shoulders like the weight of her grief. Beside her sat her two adult children, her son Obinna and daughter Chioma, both fidgeting with uncertainty, their young faces marked by the confusion that comes when the world you thought you knew suddenly shifts beneath your feet. The lawyer, an older man with graying hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, cleared his throat with formal precision. He opened the will document, and his voice became measured, procedural, reading through preliminary statements, Chidi's full name, his date of birth, his profession as a businessman. Everything felt routine, everything felt safe, until the words came that would change everything. All property, assets, vehicles, and landed holdings are bequeathed to the unmentioned heirs as per the separate deed of gift executed in 2013, the lawyer read, his voice steady, but his eyes flickering with something like pity. Ngozi's breath caught. Her hand found Chioma's on the armrest. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. "We are his heirs." 23 years earlier, Ngozi had married Chidi in a grand ceremony that blended traditional Igbo customs with Christian blessing. They had met at university, she studying public administration, him studying business. He was charming, ambitious, and promised her a life of partnership and growth. Their early years together were blissful. Chidi had worked his way up in business, trading in fabrics and later in real estate. Ngozi, meanwhile, climbed steadily through the civil service, earning promotions and respect. They bought a house in Abuja's best neighborhood, furnished it beautifully, traveled internationally, and built a life that looked perfect from the outside. The children came, Obinna first, then Chioma 3 years later. Family gatherings were warm, extended family visited frequently, and Chidi was always present at school events, anniversaries, and celebrations. To everyone who knew them, they were the gold standard of a modern Nigerian marriage, successful, balanced, and over the years, Chidi's business required frequent trips. He would tell Ngozi he was going to the village to check on properties or to the eastern region for trading deals. These trips became more frequent after about 2010, sometimes lasting a week or two, sometimes a month at a time. Ngozi never questioned this deeply. Her own career had become demanding and she trusted him. Besides, she knew his family in the village, his parents, his siblings. It seemed natural that he would maintain ties there, invest in land, and oversee family interests. When he mentioned building a new compound structure in the village, she even encouraged it. "It's good to have something in the village," she would say. "Our children should know where we come from." She never once imagined that those trips were to a different house with a different family where he was living a complete parallel life. The deception was so thorough, so normalized through casual mention and reasonable explanation that she had no reason to suspect. He had earned her trust through consistent behavior over 2 During the funeral rites, a massive traditional Igbo ceremony that Ngozi organized with precision and dignity, she began noticing strange faces among the mourners. Women she didn't recognize, speaking in hushed tones with Chidi's younger brother, Emeka. Children who looked vaguely like Chidi, standing awkwardly at the edges of the family gathering, as if they didn't quite belong, but also couldn't leave. The funeral was held at their compound in the village, a necessary tradition. Hundreds of people came, colleagues, friends, family from across Nigeria. The noise was constant.
the air thick with grief and ceremony. Ngozi moved through it all like an automaton, greeting guests, accepting condolences, ensuring the traditional rites were observed correctly. At one point, as she was serving food to visiting relatives, a woman in her early 40s, dressed impeccably in traditional wrapper and blouse, approached her with confident familiarity. She was beautiful in a different way than Ngozi, softer, rounder, with the kind of easy grace that comes from village life. She introduced herself as Mama Chidima, the mother of Chidi's children from the village. 3 days after the funeral, Ngozi's lawyer called with urgent news. A woman had appeared at his office with a stack of documents. A customary marriage certificate from 2013, signed by village elders and witnessed by multiple people. Birth certificates for 2 children listing Chidi as father. A deed of gift explicitly transferring property in the village to this other wife. Ngozi sat in her office at the Ministry of Finance, staring at photocopies of these documents on her desk. Her hands shook as she traced the signature, unmistakably Chidi's handwriting on each one. The dates were clear, the names were clear, the betrayal was catalogued, documented, and legally binding. She held the customary marriage certificate in her trembling hands. The date, August 14, 2013. The names of the witnesses, village elders she knew by reputation, the signature of the chief conducting the ceremony, everything about it screamed authenticity. The birth certificates were worse somehow. They showed children she had never known existed. Chidima, born in 2014, Eze, born in 2015, both with Chidi's name as father, both with his blood running through them. The deed of gift was the final blow. It transferred a substantial piece of village property to Adana, valued at several million naira, property that had been purchased in 2012 before the... A week later, the other wife, who introduced herself formally as Adana, Chidi's first and true wife according to customary law, filed papers with a lawyer stating her claim to the majority of Chidi's estate. She argued that the customary marriage to her took legal precedence over the Christian marriage to Ngozi, which she claimed was secondary and modern, lacking traditional foundation. The claim included the house in Abuja, where Ngozi and her children lived. When Ngozi received the notice, she sat on her bed in that house and couldn't move for 2 hours. Every object in the room suddenly felt temporary, borrowed, subject to someone else's claim. The furniture she had chosen, the artwork on the walls, the photographs of her children's milestones, none of it was truly hers anymore. She looked around the bedroom, the bed where she had slept with Chidi for 23 years, the dressing table where she had prepared for his work events, the window where she had watched the Abuja landscape change over decades. All of it, apparently, belonged to someone else now. She ran her hand across the bedspread. How many nights had she slept here, believing Chidi was hers? How many nights had he lain beside her, thinking of another woman? The bed, which had always felt like the most intimate space of her marriage, now felt like a stage where a lie had been performed. Emeka called her that evening, his tone almost apologetic. "Sister, you know this is complicated. Chidi had obligations in the village." During a tense meeting at her lawyer's office, Ngozi received copies of more documents. There was a custody arrangement from 2015 acknowledging Chidi's 2 children with Adana. There were bank transfer records showing Chidi moving substantial sums to a different account monthly, money Ngozi had thought was for business investment. There was a property deed for the village house where Adana lived, purchased in 2012 before Ngozi had even known it existed. But the most damaging document was a letter from Chidi's doctor, dated from 2 years ago, stating that Chidi had been treated for his sexually transmitted infection. The letter was marked confidential and had been misfiled among other documents. Ngozi held this letter in her trembling hands. 2 years ago. which meant he had brought this into their marital bed, which meant she had been exposed to risk without her knowledge or consent. The betrayal multiplied beyond infidelity into something darker, violation. She sat in her lawyer's office, the letter in her hands, and something inside her crystallized. This was no longer about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was about systematic deception, health risk, and the calculated dismantling of everything she had believed about her marriage. Mrs. Kalu watched her carefully, seeing the transformation happening in real time, from devastated widow to woman hardening into something else,
That evening, Ngozi sat with Obina and Chioma in her lawyer's office. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Mrs. Kalu, who specialized in family law, explained the legal situation clearly. Customary law in their state could indeed recognize Chidi's village marriage as having certain precedents depending on how the courts interpreted the sequence and legitimacy of each union. In other words, Mrs. Kalu said gently, we could lose this house. Chioma began to cry. Obina stared at the floor. But that's not even the worst part, Mrs. Kalu continued. The other family is claiming that since their marriage was traditional and took place first, even though it was hidden, they have grounds to challenge inheritance rights, property division, and potentially even custody arrangements if they choose to pursue that angle. Custody? Ngozi asked, her voice sharp. The children are adults. Technically, yes, Mrs. Kalu replied, but Chidi's will, as written, could affect trust distributions and property allocations that impact them directly. Obina finally looked up. So what do we do? He asked. For a moment, Ngozi felt something like hope. What if she simply surrendered? What if she let Adana have a portion of the estate, accepted the customary marriage as legitimate in some limited way, and moved on? The pain might be less. The family fracture might be less severe. Life could return to something resembling normal. Groups, sometimes individually. The message was always the same, delivered with varying degrees of gentleness. Ngozi, you know how these things are. Men are weak. Chidi made a mistake, but he has built a family with that village woman. The children are innocent. Can you not find it in your heart to be generous? Sister, fighting this in court will only shame the family. Let us settle this matter amongst ourselves as is proper. Ngozi, your marriage to Chidi was good, but this other union came from tradition. We cannot fight tradition. It has power over us. Each visit was an attempt to move her towards surrender, disguised as an appeal to family harmony. The community gossip was relentless. She heard whispers at the market, saw the pity in colleagues' eyes at work. The narrative being crafted was that Ngozi was the difficult one, the modern woman unwilling to accept her husband's divided loyalties. That evening, Obina came to her with a question that terrified her more than any court ruling. Mother, do you think we'll lose the house? He asked quietly. And if we do, what happens to us? Chioma, overhearing, looked up from her phone, fear crossing her face. Ngozi realized that her children were not just witnessing a legal battle. They were watching their sense of security crumble. They were questioning whether their childhood home would still be theirs. They were wondering if their inheritance, the only tangible proof that their father had loved them, would be stolen by a family he had hidden. She pulled both her children close. We're going. The courtroom was sterile and institutional. Gray walls, wooden benches, the weight of law hanging in the air like humidity. Ngozi sat at a table with her lawyer, Mrs. Kalu, surrounded by legal documents and folders. Across from her, Adana sat with her own lawyer, flanked by Emeka and two village elders who had come to support her claim. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, reviewed the documents with an expression that gave nothing away. "This is a complex matter," she said finally. "We have two marriage unions, one Christian, one customary, both claiming legitimacy. We have property disputes, inheritance claims, and competing narratives about the deceased's intentions." She looked directly at Ngozi. "Mrs. Ngozi, do you deny that a customary marriage ceremony took place between your husband and this woman in 2013? Ngozi's lawyer squeezed her arm, a warning not to speak emotionally. "I deny that I knew about it," Ngozi replied firmly, "and I deny that it should supersede our Christian marriage, which took place in 1998 and was acknowledged by my husband as his primary union for 23 years. The judge nodded. Ngozi's team of investigators, hired by her lawyer, began reconstructing Chidi's hidden life with methodical precision. They interviewed people in the village, tracked financial records, and pieced together a timeline of deception that was almost mathematical in its planning. Chidi had met Adana in 2012 at a village gathering when he was supposedly just visiting family. By 2013, a customary marriage ceremony was conducted, quietly, without fanfare. He established a second property, funded through business accounts that Ngozi had no access to. By 2014, Adana was pregnant. By 2015, a second child. Throughout this entire period, Chidi maintained his life with Ngozi, attending her career events, celebrating anniversaries, sleeping in their marital bed. The investigators found bank statements showing consistent monthly transfers to AK Enterprises, a shell company that funneled money to Adana and the village household. They found hotel receipts from business trips that overlapped with visits to the village. They found photographs in Chidi's hidden email account, pictures of him with Adana and their children at celebrations and family gatherings, smiling, intimate, belonging. In one photograph, Chidi stood with his arm around Adana's waist at what looked like a village festival. His expression was completely at ease, genuinely happy. The same expression he had worn in photographs with Ngozi, but somehow Chidi's extended family, aunts, cousins, elders, began approaching Ngozi more aggressively now that the court battle had made the situation public. "Ngozi, we know you have done a lot for this family," one aunt said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Nobody denies that, but money issues can cause misunderstanding. Your brother says there is inflation. Cement that was 200 is now..." "I am not stupid. I've done the maths. Even if everything tripled, what I saw there is not equal to what I sent." An uncle approached her at the market, his tone almost threatening. "Sister, your marriage to Chidi was good, but this other union came from tradition. We cannot fight tradition. It has power over us." The pressure intensified. Her own mother, who had initially supported Ngozi, began subtly suggesting that perhaps a compromise would be wise. "Your father would want you to find peace," she said, as if peace meant surrendering her rights. Even at her workplace, the pressure was relentless. A senior colleague took her aside. "Ngozi, I heard about your situation. These things are difficult. Perhaps you should just accept what he left you and move on." 3 months into the court case, Ngozi's lawyer requested DNA testing for the 2 children Adana claimed were Chidi's. Adana and her lawyer agreed, confident in the children's paternity. The results, when they came back, confirmed what Adana had always known. Both children were biologically Chidi's. The DNA tests also revealed something else, a genetic marker suggesting one of the children had received treatment for a condition that ran in Chidi's family. The evidence was now undeniable. These were Chidi's legitimate children. In the eyes of customary law, particularly as interpreted by the judge presiding over the case, This gave Adana's union substantial legal weight. At the next court hearing, the judge's tone shifted noticeably. The DNA evidence clearly establishes paternity, the judge stated, which means we must acknowledge that Mr. Chidi had two families, both documented, both established through recognized unions. The question before this court is how to distribute his estate fairly given this complexity. Fairly. The word hit Ngozi like a physical blow. To the judge, betraying one wife to establish another family was now simply a complexity to be managed through equitable distribution. The word fairly revealed the judge's assumption that Ngozi must share what she thought was solely hers. That evening, Ngozi sat alone in her office, staring at the DNA test results. The evidence that proved her worst fears was also the evidence that might destroy her case.
Two weeks later, Adana's lawyer approached Ngozi with his settlement proposal. Adana would accept 40% of the estate if Ngozi agreed to publicly acknowledge the customary marriage as legitimate and stop contesting the inheritance claims. For a moment, Ngozi was tempted. The offer would end the legal battle, prevent further family division, and allow her to move forward with the bulk of the estate secured. She sat with Mrs. Kalu, reviewing the settlement terms. "It's not a bad offer," her lawyer said carefully. "You would keep 60% of the estate, which is substantial. Your children would be secure. The legal battle would end." Ngozi looked at the papers. 60% felt like victory. 60% would secure her children's future, allow her to pay off debts, enable her to move forward. But then she thought about the prenup, the document Chidi had signed, promising her singular devotion and transparent dealings. Accepting this settlement would mean validating his violation of that promise. It would mean telling her children that betrayal could be managed through compromise. She thought about what she would tell them. "Your father betrayed me, but it's okay because the law gave us something anyway." No, that wasn't the lesson she wanted them to learn. She told her lawyer, "Reject it. We're going to prove that Chidi violated our prenuptial."
As Ngozi's team dug deeper, they uncovered something darker. Emeka, Chidi's younger brother, had been actively facilitating the double life. He had helped secure the village property, had introduced Chidi to Adana, and had been aware of the situation for years. More damning, financial records showed that Emeka had been receiving money from Chidi, payments disguised as business consultancy fees, throughout the marriage. Essentially, Chidi was paying his brother to keep the secret. The amounts were staggering. Over 10 years, Emeka had received nearly 50 million naira. He hadn't just known about the affair, he had been actively complicit, and he had been rewarded for his silence. When this evidence was presented in court, Emeka's face went pale. His lawyer tried to argue that the payments were legitimate business transactions, but the timing was too convenient, the amounts too suspiciously round. The judge looked at Emeka with clear disgust. "You have been complicit in defrauding one of your family members," the judge stated coldly. "This court notes your involvement and the breach of family trust it represents." Motions were filed to have him removed as executor of Chidi's will and replaced with an independent administrator. The family's united front began. 2 months before the final hearing, Ngozi's investigator contacted her with urgent news. He had found a witness, a village elder who had conducted the customary marriage ceremony between Chidi and Adana. The elder was willing to testify. More importantly, the elder would testify that Chidi had explicitly stated during the ceremony that this marriage was a secondary arrangement and that his primary and legal wife was Ngozi. The elder had recorded this in the ceremony notes, a detail that had been deliberately omitted from the documentation provided to the court. This testimony, combined with the prenup and the financial evidence, could prove that Chidi himself had not considered his customary marriage to supersede his Christian marriage to Ngozi. It proved that he knew what he was doing was wrong. When Ngozi heard this news, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time since the will reading, she felt like she might actually win this. The witness provided the final piece of the puzzle. It proved that even Chidi, in the moment of conducting the customary ceremony, knew he was betraying Ngozi. He went through with it anyway, showing premeditation and full awareness of wrongdoing.
A week before the final hearing, Ngozi stood in her lawyer's office, surrounded by organized evidence: the prenup, the financial records, the witness statements, the DNA tests, the doctor's letter, the testimony from the village elder. On her lawyer's desk lay the final motion, a request that the judge declare the customary marriage void, based on evidence of Chidi's explicit statement that it was secondary to his marriage to Ngozi. "This is strong," Mrs. Kalu said, reviewing the documents one final time. "Very strong. I believe we can win." But she paused, looking at Ngozi carefully. "The question is, what do you want? Do you want to win or do you want reconciliation? Because tomorrow we file this motion, and after that there is no going back. Adana will be fully exposed, and Mecca will face legal consequences. Your family will be fractured openly." Ngozi looked at the evidence spread before her, the physical manifestation of her husband's systematic betrayal. She thought about all the times she had been asked to forgive, to understand, to prioritize peace. She thought about her children, watching to see if their mother would stand for truth or accept convenient lies. She thought about the next time a young woman would discover her husband's infidelity and would be pressured to be understanding. What example would Ngozi set? "File it," she said simply. The act ended with her lawyer's hand moving toward the phone, about to call and file the motion. That the courtroom was packed. News of the case had spread, and people filled the benches: journalists, family members, curious onlookers. Ngozi sat at her table with Mrs. Kalu, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but her heart pounding. The judge entered and everyone stood. She took her seat and reviewed her notes one final time before beginning to speak. "This has been a complex case involving two marriage unions, competing inheritance claims, and fundamental questions about the legitimacy of contracts formed without full disclosure," she began. "After careful consideration of all evidence presented, including testimony, documentation, and DNA analysis, this court has reached a decision." Ngozi's breath stopped. The prenuptial agreement signed by both parties in 1998 is valid and binding. In that agreement, both parties explicitly agreed that any spouse engaging in hidden financial transactions or secret family arrangements would forfeit certain inheritance claims. The customary marriage ceremony of 2013, conducted without the knowledge of the Christian wife, constitutes exactly such hidden arrangements. Adana's lawyer was scribbling notes furiously. Furthermore, the testimony of the village elder establishes that Mr. Chidi explicitly stated during the customary ceremony that his marriage to Ngozi was his primary and legal union. This demonstrates that even the deceased did not consider the customary marriage to supersede the Christian marriage. The judge paused, and in that silence,
Ngozi felt something shift inside her. Therefore, this court rules as follows. The estate of Chidi Okafor will be divided as follows. 70% to Ngozi and her children as the primary family, 20% to Adana and her children as acknowledged secondary family, and 10% to be held in trust for any outstanding obligations or claims. Ngozi's vision blurred with tears. Additionally, Emeka Okafor is found to have engaged in fraud and is ordered to repay funds he received as part of the cover-up with interest. The customary marriage of 2013 is declared secondary in legal standing to the Christian marriage of 1998. The judge struck her gavel, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs. As Ngozi listened to the ruling, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, but relief. The validation she had fought for was finally being delivered.
After the ruling, Ngozi's lawyer asked her a question that had been puzzling her. Why didn't you mention the prenup earlier? It would have strengthened our case from the beginning. Ngozi thought back to 1998 when she and Chidi were engaged. They had been young, modern, and progressive. The prenup had been Chidi's idea. If we love each other truly, he had said then, taking her hands, we should have nothing to hide from each other. This agreement just formalizes that commitment. Ngozi had loved him for proposing it. It had felt like proof of his integrity and his vision of their marriage as a partnership of equals. They had signed it together and then filed it away as the excited planning for their wedding consumed their attention. She had completely forgotten about it over the years. It had sat in a filing cabinet untouched while their marriage unfolded. When Chidi began his double life, the prenup sat there silently, waiting to be rediscovered, a document from a younger version of him who had promised honesty. I didn't think I would ever need it, she finally answered her lawyer. I thought the love was enough. The irony was devastating. The prenup existed because Chidi had suggested it, framing it as evidence of his commitment. It was a document rooted in love and trust. Ngozi's failure to remember it wasn't negligence, it was faith in the marriage. Chidi's violation of the agreement wasn't just infidelity, it was a betrayal of the very promise he had made about transparency and commitment. In the weeks after the ruling, Adana's entire position collapsed. The public acknowledgement she had sought was not granted. Instead, she was now legally classified as a secondary spouse, a designation that carried weight and shame in her traditional community. She reached out to Ngozi, asking for a meeting. They met at a coffee shop in Abuja, far from the village and away from family witnesses. Adana looked diminished. The confidence she had carried into courtrooms had evaporated. She was a woman facing the consequences of being part of a deception, now branded by law as secondary and derivative. In her community, the label meant everything. It determined her status, her children's inheritance prospects, her standing in village society. I didn't know, Adana said quietly, her voice no longer commanding. I thought he would divorce you. He promised he would make it right. He said he would give me everything. Ngozi looked at this woman, the woman who had stolen years of her marriage, who had lived in a house Ngozi's money built, who had borne Chidi's children in secret, and felt something unexpected. Pity. He lied to both of us, Ngozi replied simply. For the first time, Adana really looked at Ngozi, not as a rival, but as another woman who had been deceived. Her eyes filled with tears. I have been branded, she whispered. In my community, I am now second. My children are now bastards legally. What was I fighting for? Ngozi reached across the table and placed her hand on Adana's. I don't know, she said, but I know we were both betrayed. The conversation was brief and painful, but it marked a turning point. The antagonism that had defined their relationship shifted into something more complex, the shared victimhood of two women used by the same man.
Emeka faced legal consequences for his role in the fraud. He was required to repay significant funds to Ngozi's estate and faced the disgrace of being publicly identified as complicit in his brother's deception. He came to see Ngozi, standing at her doorway looking broken and aged. The confident brother who had asked her to find peace was now humiliated and diminished. "I was afraid," he said simply. "Chidi was the stronger personality. When he asked me to help, I didn't know how to say no. And then when I had taken money, I had to keep helping to protect myself." Ngozi listened without responding. "Your children will not speak to me," he continued. "The family is divided. I lost my brother's respect long before he died because I helped him betray you. I've thought about this every day and I'm sorry." Ngozi nodded, accepting the apology without forgiving or condemning. She had learned that apologies didn't undo harm, but they were part of the process of moving forward. Emeka's fall was his own making, but it was also the inevitable consequence of choosing complicity over honesty. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I will leave Abuja," he said quietly. "I think my presence here only makes things worse. I will go back to the village and try to rebuild some kind of life. I owe you a debt I can never repay, but I will pay what I can and I will stop making things worse." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I hope one day you can forgive me, sister. I know I don't deserve it, but I hope anyway." 3 months after the court ruling, Chidi's extended family, the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had pressured Ngozi to compromise, approached her with a new proposal. They wanted to organize a family meeting where all could gather, acknowledge what had happened, ask forgiveness, and move forward as a united family. It was framed as an opportunity for healing and restoration. A family member Ngozi had always been close to sat with her in her living room, speaking softly. "We know we failed you," the woman said. "We were afraid and we asked you to bear the burden alone. If you can find it in your heart to let us gather together, all of us, including Adana's children, perhaps we can rebuild what Chidi destroyed." For a moment, Ngozi considered it. The family could be restored. The fractures could be mended. The story could have a redemptive conclusion where everyone was forgiven and everything moved forward together. She could imagine it, a family gathering, tears, apologies, the slow healing of relationships fractured by revelation. She could return to being simply Chidi's widow, part of his extended family, safely embedded in their structures and rituals. It was seductive. But then she thought about what that would mean. Accepting that her husband's betrayal was something the family could heal from together. It would mean positioning herself as the wife who allowed her pain to be absorbed for the sake of family unity. It would mean teaching her children that women's betrayal is something to be endured quietly and forgiven collectively. "Thank you for the offer," she told her relative, "but I think what I need now is distance, not reunion. I need to rebuild my life on my own terms, not on the family's timeline."
The bigger threat was whether her children would stay with her after the family was so thoroughly fractured. Obina and Chioma had watched their mother fight. They had seen their father exposed as a fraud. They had witnessed family members turn against each other. They had heard cousins suggest that maybe mother was being unreasonable. Would they blame Ngozi for being the reason the family broke apart? One evening, both children came to her home. They sat together in the sitting room, the house that was now legally and fully theirs, and Obina spoke. "Mother, we wanted you to know that we're staying with you. Not because you are entitled to our loyalty, but because you showed us what integrity looks like. You didn't compromise. You didn't accept a version of the truth that was easier or softer. You fought for what was right, and we're proud of you." Chioma added, and we're sorry for every moment you had to face this alone. Ngozi held both her children, tears finally falling. Not tears of grief or rage, but tears of being seen and supported. I was so afraid you would think I was wrong to fight, she whispered. You were never wrong, Obinna said. You were brave. Despite declining the formal family meeting, Ngozi agreed to one final gathering, not for reconciliation, but for clarity. She sat across from Chidi's parents, his extended family, Emeka, and representatives of the village. She spoke clearly and calmly. I loved your son for 23 years. I built a life with him, contributed my career and resources to our partnership, and expected honesty. He chose a different path. That path has caused pain to many people, to me, to our children, to you, and even to the other woman and her children. I forgive him because I cannot hold on to rage, but I will not pretend this didn't happen, and I will not accept that it should be absorbed quietly for the sake of family peace. She paused, looking at each face. I am moving forward with my life. I hope you will each examine your own role in enabling or accepting this deception. That is where healing begins, with honesty, not with restoration of comfortable lies. With that, she stood, walked out of that room, and did not look back. A year after the court's ruling, Ngozi had restructured her life. She had kept the Abuja house, secured her children's inheritance, and invested in new properties and business ventures. More importantly, she had returned to her own identity beyond being Chidi's wife. She took a promotion to a senior position at the Ministry of Finance. She traveled, not to fulfill a husband's social expectations, but for her own growth and pleasure. She developed friendships that weren't rooted in being part of a couple. She volunteered with an organization supporting women in legal battles with their families. The house that had felt like contested territory now felt like her own. The furniture she chose reflected her taste, not compromise. The silence that had once felt isolating now felt peaceful. One afternoon, standing in her office with a window view of Abuja, Ngozi realized something. She had finally become the woman she might have been if she had prioritized herself from the beginning. The betrayal had forced her to do what she might never have done willingly, choose herself completely. She no longer defined herself by her marriage or her role in her family structure. She was Ngozi, a woman who had survived deception and emerged stronger, wiser, and more fundamentally herself. 2 years after the final court ruling, Ngozi received a call from a young woman, a colleague's sister, asking to meet her. They sat in a quiet restaurant, and the young woman began to tell her story. She had discovered that her husband was maintaining a secret relationship with another woman, possibly another family. What should I do? She asked Ngozi. Should I try to fix it? Should I forgive him? Everyone says I should try to save the marriage. Ngozi listened without interrupting, watching the fear and confusion on the young woman's face, the same expression she had worn just years ago. Then she leaned forward and took the young woman's hand. Let me tell you what I learned, she began, and her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Your marriage is not something you should save by diminishing yourself. Your husband's choices are not something you should absorb for the sake of family